The ultimatum proclaiming the subjugation over the Zulu people is over. Now the British-led forces in South Africa gathered to launch their invasion across Natal and Transvaal borders and into Zululand. Led by Lord Chelmsford, the general has less men than he'd like. In particular, he lacks the professionalism that comes with British imperial troops. But no matter. He, with High Commissioner Henry Bartle Frere, believe this will be a quick victory, and the primitive Zulu, after a decisive victory, will capitulate to British rule, forming a British-led South African Confederation. But this invasion is illegal. In fact, Frere and Chelmsford were specifically told not to start a war with the Zulus, yet here they were. They'd taken advantage of the slow, arduous journey messages took when going from South Africa to Great Britain. They hoped that by the time London learned of their war, and responded, said war would be over, and Zululand now part of the British Empire. On January 11th, 1879, the invasion began with the crossing of the Buffalo River. Chelmsford had divided his small army of 16,500 men into 5 columns. The No. 1 Column, led by Colonel Charles Pearson, would invade from the south, across the Tugela River, securing the southern flank. The No. 2 Column, led by Brevet Colonel Anthony Durnford, and consisting of mostly cavalry, would guard the Buffalo and Tugela rivers in case the Zulu army made a thrust into Natal. The No. 4 Column, led by Colonel Evelyn Wood, invaded from the north, sweeping south to strike the Zulu capital from above. The No. 5 Column, led by Colonel Hugh Rawlins, would be a reactionary force and stay defensive. Then there was the No. 3 Column, and by far the largest. Led by Colonel Richard Thomas Glynn, Lord Chelmsford would use them as the main thrust toward the Zulu capital, Ulundi. He effectively usurped command. They crossed the Buffalo River by Rorke's Drift, where a hospital and outpost had been established. The Zulu army, led by the great Ntshingwayo, watched the British carefully, often infiltrating their ranks, probing them, and successfully evading a direct conflict. This greatly angers the impatient Chelmsford, who knows time is not on his side. He feared a possible guerrilla war, and by the invasion's 11th day, that seemed to be the case. While the Zulu impi, armed mainly with their assegais and cowhide shields, moved about Zululand with ease, the British were cumbersome and slow. Chelmsford's intelligence was also spotty at best, using unreliable maps and mere word of mouth for what lay before him. So by January 21st, the No. 3 Column had established themselves at the foot of Isandlwana Hill, a mere 10 miles from Rorke's Drift. It had been 11 days, and still no sign of the main Zulu army. Until that night.
Hello everybody, and welcome to AN Productions, a channel where we discuss military history, film history, and history in general. Today we are discussing military histories for one of the greatest military disasters of all time. I'm your host, Adam Noyce. There is a plethora of different POVs of the following events, and it has proven quite difficult discerning what memory is trustworthy and what isn't. I'd like to apologize right now if I don't include every single point of view that there possibly is out there. For the sake of a compelling narrative and for brevity, I've narrowed this story down to a series of characters. Lieutenant Colonel Pulleine, Colonel Anthony Durnford, and Ntshingwayo from the Zulu point of view. Minor characters include Captain Reginald Younghusband, Lieutenant Henry Curling, Lieutenant Charles Pope, Captain Edward Essex, and Captain George Shepstone. There are a few other in there as well. Now, let us proceed.
Chelmsford set Major John Dartnell to the southeast of Isandlwana. He led a small group of Natal mounted police, men well experienced with both the Zulu and the terrain. They were riding toward the Malakata and Halazakazi range, where they'd meet a party of Natal Native Contingent, who were looking to be relieved after several days on the march. Along the way, Zulus were spotted, and upon chase, what was just a handful of young boys morphed into thousands of running in the direction of Ulundi. This had been the most Zulus reported thus far in the invasion. Was this possibly the main Zulu army? The No. 3 Column consisted of 12 infantry companies of the 24th Regiment of Foot. These were considered the most reliable and battle-hardened soldiers partaking in the invasion. 5 from the 1st Battalion and 7 from the 2nd Battalion, numbering close to 1,200 men. Irregular local cavalry were also present, many of which were Boer or Natal Mounted Police. An artillery detachment from the No. 5 Battery Royal Artillery also accompanied this center column, with 6 field guns in total, 2 being 7-pound muzzleloaders. The Natal Native Contingent added an additional 2,500 men, most of them exiled Zulus. These men were led by white European officers and NCOs, who considered them primarily a labor force more than one for fighting. Of these white officers and NCOs, one eyewitness described them as, quote,
"A motley crowd. A few of them old soldiers and ex-clerks. The majority of them runaway sailors, ex-marines, and East London boatmen. They were an awful tough crowd."
Traveling with them were 200 supply wagons, 4,000 oxen, and 200 civilian drivers and other followers, like local politicians, reporters, and more. In total, they had somewhere between 4,500 and 4,900 men. 3,900 to 4,100 of them were true fighting men. By 2 a.m. on January 22, 1879, Chelmsford made a decision. Word from Major John Dartnell had been the best evidence thus far of seeing the main Zulu impi, and impatience was abound. He decided he'd risk to split the No. 3 Column in two, going against his original intention of consolidation. When asked, he also thought it unnecessary to set up defenses around Isandlwana Camp, especially if they were to be on the march come daybreak. Chelmsford would be accompanied by Colonel Richard Thomas Glynn, with 6 companies of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th, a detachment of NNC pioneers, 4 of his 6 cannons, and 3/4 of his mounted troops. This was about 2/3 of No. 3 Column's strength. He'd leave behind 5 companies of the 1st Battalion and 1 company of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th Regiment of Foot, 5 companies of NNC, the 2 remaining cannons, both 7-pounders, and 1/4 of his mounted troops. This numbered around 1,400 men, No. 3 Column's remaining third. Chelmsford appeared to have gone for broke. He also sent for the No. 2 Column to be brought forward from Rorke's Drift. Durnford, having been scolded by Chelmsford for acting too hastily, eagerly accepted this call. He'd bring around 500 men, including a rocket battery, to then join Chelmsford's forward command against the Zulus. Durnford's horsemen, most being Natal Native horse, some of the best cavalry in South Africa, crossed the Buffalo River at around 3 o'clock in the morning. With Chelmsford now on the march, he left Isandlwana to an officer from the 1st 24th. His name was Henry Pulleine, a man not known for frontline experience, but his skill as an expert administrator in logistics during the 9th Cape Frontier Wars. Despite horrid terrain, long-distance guerrilla raids, and terrible weather, Pulleine maintained a constant flow of supplies, even to those on the very outer rims of the frontier. This skill proved key in relieving the strain of several units besieged by the enemy between 1877 and 1878. Through scouts and luck, Pulleine managed to sneak their supplies through and around rebel positions, garnering the attention of many commanders throughout South Africa. Because of his work, he was given command of a depot in Pietermaritzburg. Now he found himself at Isandlwana, in an open camp, with 2/3 of the column marching somewhere to the east. But news that Colonel Durnford was arriving gave him some semblance of comfort. When he asked Lord Chelmsford if they should laager, Chelmsford balked. Why should they? There was no danger of Zulu attack. They'd also be on the march come early morning. Pulleine accepted this logic as he watched the men marching off with Chelmsford, the fog thick but rapidly lifting as the sun peaked above the distant horizon. Watching from less than half a mile away, protected by the many dongas and gullies naturally found throughout Zululand, spies were noting the defenseless Isandlwana camp. One of these scouts called for his fastest runner, the boy appeared, and he was ordered to find Ntshingwayo, the Zulus' commanding general. Isandlwana Camp is splitting its force and is left with no entrenchments. A perfect scenario. When word reached Ntshingwayo, camping with his army, he knew it was time to spring his trap. He'd already started the domino effect by sending around 2,000 Zulus to distract Chelmsford. The fact Chelmsford took the bait so easily couldn't have played into Ntshingwayo's hands better if he tried. Leaving the camp wide open had also presented a scenario perfect for adhering to the Zulu king Ceshwayo's standing orders. Do not attack an entrenched enemy, and do not cross into Natal. He called his chiefs together, and they would march toward Isandlwana, using the mountains to screen their movements. They would attack the remaining Red soldiers the following day, 23rd January, 1879. The Zulu army was made up of militias from villages across Zululand, and each had their own leader, or Nduna. Ntshingwayo intended to unleash his army in the normal Zulu formation, the horns of the buffalo. In the center was the chest, made up of less experienced warriors, while also being the largest formation. They would attack the enemy head-on and likely take the most casualties. This consisted of 7,000 and 9,000 warriors from Unkijo, Ukanda Umpemvu, and part of the Undwengu Corps. Then there were the right and left horns. They would attack the flanks while their enemy was too busy fighting the chest. They'd encircle the enemy, linking up somewhere to the rear. The right horn consisted of 3,000 to 4,000 men of the Undududu, Unnokenke regiments, and the remainder of the Undwengu, while the left had around 6,000 men of the Ingo Bamakose, Unbonembe, and Uve regiments. Behind the chest were the loins, the reserves, led by Prince Dabluamanze Kampande, the half-brother of King Cetshwayo. Like all the Ndunas of Ntshingwayo's army, he was very much eager for a fight, but feared his reserves, made up of more elderly and younger men, would miss their chance for glory. For glory is what the Zulu warrior sought, ordered by their king to eat the red soldiers and wash their spears with enemy blood, to rid their homeland of this invading army. An invading army bent on destroying the Zulu nation once and for all. At 6 a.m., Chelmsford and his staff found Major John Dartnell still holding the ridge with his Natal mounted police. Luckily, the Zulu hadn't attacked them in the night. The Natal mounted police didn't even have a camp per se, their supply wagons having never arrived. His men had sat here all throughout the night, wide awake, listening to the Zulus moving about, and now they looked exhausted. Chelmsford then provided the proper rations and provisions, and himself scouted the surrounding hills. Glynn had 2 of his 6 companies escort Chelmsford ahead. Together they found a large number of Zulus and readied for an attack. But the native contingent were hesitant, giving the Zulus time to escape. Dartnell then returned, and the NMP rode into the valley below and stumbled across the Zulus. A firefight ensued, some of the Zulus having outdated muskets. The result was nearly 30 Zulu dead. This pushed the Zulus to the next ridgeline, and infantry battalions moved forward and flushed the Zulus out of their hiding spots. They counted around 50 dead after the skirmish was over. Theophilus Shepstone Jr. also reported to have seen the Zulu chief in charge of his militia, and chased him for several miles. This accomplished little, the Zulu chief having escaped. Shepstone's brother, George, was currently leading a troop of Natal native horse with Colonel Durnford's No.2 Column. By 9:30 a.m., the skirmish had stopped. It proved that the main impi weren't between the Izipezi Hills and the nearest village. Chelmsford decided to establish a camp just below where Major Dartnell had spent the night. It was time for breakfast. But this didn't sit well with some of the more experienced officers. One of these was Commandant George Hamilton Brown. Shouldn't Chelmsford order Colonel Pulleine to break camp and reunify their column? Chelmsford agreed, but wanted to finish his breakfast first. Hamilton Brown's battalion of Natal Native Contingent were still well on the march, having not eaten in 2 days. At this point, Hamilton Brown refused breakfast. While he wasn't particularly fond of his large black battalions, he didn't feel right eating when his men were starving. He left, much to Chelmsford's disdain. A horse arrived in camp, a paper in hand. It read, quote,
Staff officer report just came in that the Zulus are advancing in force from left to front of the camp, 8:5 a.m.
Chelmsford and Glynn didn't know what to make of this. What sizable force? But it seemed Pulleine wasn't too worried, meaning the colonel likely didn't think it the main Zulu army. Thus Chelmsford reserved himself to finishing his breakfast, not nervous in the slightest. Pulleine had more than enough forces to hold off a Zulu attack, should it come. Glynn began to protest, saying they hadn't spotted the main Zulu impi yet. Any notice of a sizable Zulu force could be problematic, with their columns stretched over miles and effectively split in two. Chelmsford grew annoyed, called for the naval officer of his staff, Lieutenant Barclay Milne. The man possessed a telescope, and Chelmsford ordered him to place it atop a hill where Isandlwana would be visible. The man stopped eating, bowed, then obeyed his order. Milne climbed to the nearby hill with the bulky telescope over his shoulder. He could barely discern Isandlwana Camp through the haze, noting nothing out of the ordinary except the cattle had been brought in. He reported this back to Chelmsford, and only now did Chelmsford dispatch orders for Pulleine to strike camp. Chelmsford summoned Brevet Major Stuart Smith of the artillery to join Isandlwana and help with their mobilization. He also wrote a letter to be delivered to Pulleine by Captain Alan Gardner, informing Pulleine to strike camp and march to the rest of No.3 Column. Meanwhile, Chelmsford and Glynn would continue their advance into Zululand. Noon had come, and their forces were greatly scattered, broken apart by the awful terrain. They could hear gunshots now, a clear engagement somewhere. Had Pulleine encountered those Zulu skirmishers reported earlier? Then came cannon fire. This spurred Chelmsford on, and he rode atop the nearest hillside. He looked through his binoculars, could see the vague outline of Isandlwana Camp, along with gun flashes from the two artillery pieces. Captain Garter came back from Isandlwana with a message to Chelmsford from Lieutenant Colonel Pulleine. The letter read, quote,
Heavy firing near left of camp. Shepstone has come in for reinforcements and reports that his horse are falling back. Whole camp turned out and fighting about 1 mile to left flank.
Just what the hell was happening? Upon the march, furthest to the rear of Chelmsford's column, a different rider appeared, disheveled and out of breath. "Zulus!" he yelled, riding directly toward the general. This man was from Hamilton Brown's battalion, and the rider explained they'd turn about and were marching toward Isandlwana. In fact, Hamilton Brown had sent a curt message. Quote,
For God's sake, come back with all your men! The camp is surrounded and will be taken unless helped!
Hamilton Brown's 1st Battalion of the 3rd Regiment of the Natal Native Contingent had continued their slow march toward Isandlwana. He could see a large Zulu force swinging around to the camp's right, and smoke likely moving in their direction. With his men starving and exhausted, he halted the march, then ordered his men into a tight ring. The European officers and NCOs then took their position in the center, and they prepared for a fight. Hamilton Brown had sent more urgent messages that Isandlwana was under attack, and he was in grave danger too. In fact, this very much looked like the main Zulu impi, and what was nearest to him was one of the horns. He had no doubt that Chelmsford would have received one of his messages by now, and was doing the right thing, marching back toward Isandlwana with all haste. Then he saw more Zulus to his rear, and he ordered everyone down to hug the ground. Hopefully the mass of Zulus hadn't seen him, for if they did, his battalion stood no chance. With Major Stuart having traveled back to Isandlwana, his second-in-command immediately ordered his 4 cannons about. He believed in Hamilton Brown's report, and would march to the aid of his commanding officer.
No, this was not to be. Orders came for the artillery to turn about once again and continue their march to Chelmsford's camp. It was decided that Colonel Pulleine could just simply defend himself, and once this skirmish was over, they'd finish striking camp. He blatantly downplayed the danger unfolding before him. Those warnings from Pulleine, Hamilton Brown, and countless other local scouts. Chelmsford simply could not fathom the reality he now faced. We interrupt your normal broadcast to bring you this brief message. ANP is proud to have become a HistoryFix affiliate. HistoryFix is a streaming service for history nerds like you and me. This includes some of our own productions, such as the uncut and uncensored version of our documentary on the Battle at Remagen, along with our short documentary breaking down the Boston Massacre moment by moment. So head on over using either the link on your screen right now or by scanning the QR code and save 30% off the annual subscription price by using the promo code 30% off. Thank you, and let's keep history alive.
Two mounted pickets of the Natal Carbineers rode to the top of Cavaye Hill. They could see beyond Conical Hill and the Unyezi Plains. One squinted, pointed, saw movement. He asked the other to confirm, and he'd seen it too. Zulus. These Zulus were around 2 miles away, and there was a considerable amount of them. Numbers similar to those reported by Major Dartnell. Of the two, the fastest riding of them was sent down the winding trails and toward camp, his mission to deliver a report directly to Lieutenant Colonel Pulleine. The trumpets called, and the men of Isandlwana Camp stirred. Many hadn't slept well in the night, Chelmsford's decision to go on the march keeping many awake. They grumbled their usual grumbles, stretched, then gathered together for breakfast. Pulleine was one of them, the man drinking his tea, his eyes to the south. That is where Durnford was to arrive, and he expected to see the colonel at any moment.
However, a rider showed up coming from the opposite direction. He all but flew toward Pulleine, saluted, and then detailed the Zulus to the north. That's exactly where the Zulus weren't supposed to be.
Unbeknownst to them, this Zulu force consisted of many Indunas, including the great Ntshingwayo. Despite being 70 years old, he marched with his troops and stood directly in the front lines. Ntshingwayo had already sprung his trap. Having learned of this Zulu scouting force, Pulleine was justifiably troubled. If the main impi were toward Chelmsford, they'd be appearing to the southeast, not the north. Perhaps this was just a larger scouting party. Therefore, despite the numbers, Major Dartnell's intelligence was still correct. And at any moment, Chelmsford would call for Pulleine to strike camp and march southeast. Nevertheless, an adjutant suggested deploying the men, as a precaution should the small Zulu force want to fight. Yes, thought Pulleine. Sound the alert. The troops began to move. They were angry, most having just received their breakfast, but they unstacked their rifles, put on their tanned helmets, and marched out to the north of Isandlwana. Pulleine also had the 2 remaining 7-pounder cannons deployed along the front line as well. They were muzzle-loader mountain guns, but they do a considerable amount of damage to any oncoming Zulu force. Lieutenant Henry Curling of the Royal Artillery led these 2 guns. There he deployed them in front of the remnants of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th Regiment. He scanned ahead with his binoculars, saw nothing, and the long wait began. Meanwhile, Pulleine went to his tent, wrote a note to Chelmsford, and had a rider send it immediately. It had just turned 8:30 a.m. Durnford finally arrived at Isandlwana Camp to discover Pulleine had, at least somewhat, taken the threat of Zulus to the north seriously. Durnford ordered his troops to wheel about the left center of camp, then commanded, "Front! Form troop!" They all halted, black men and white, looking splendid and well-disciplined, the colonel feeling pride. He asked Pulleine where to place his men, and Pulleine instructed him to move below the Natal Native Contingent lines closer to Nkutu Ridge. Durnford obeyed. Once they arrived there, he allowed his men to dismount and rest for a while. Pulleine and Durnford then discussed command. With Durnford being a colonel, that made him the senior rank, and he should assume command of the camp. However, Durnford had little interest. He said, quote,
I'm not going to interfere with you. I'm not going to remain in camp.
Durnford expected to find orders from Chelmsford, but Pulleine hadn't received any. Pulleine then relayed what information he knew of reported Zulu movement. There were likely 3 columns, but they were all separated. One seems to be moving toward Chelmsford and away from Isandlwana. All this information, gathered by different Imperial and local scouts, was very confusing to both Durnford and Pulleine. Durnford likely remembered coming across Lieutenant John Marriott Chard on his way to Isandlwana. Chard had seen a large body of Zulus moving to, perhaps, cut off Chelmsford from Rorke's drift. He remembered the reprimand given to him by Lord Chelmsford only a few days prior for acting too hastily. He thus tells Pulleine to stop worrying, and that soon he'd ride to Chelmsford where the main Zulu army was likely headed. Pulleine seemed relieved by this, then offered Durnford some breakfast. It is around this time Pulleine called the camp to stand down. The bugles blew, and the companies of the 24th began wandering back into camp to return to their uneaten and now cold breakfasts. After they had begun eating, riders came down from the nearby hills to the west. These were Lieutenant Higginson and Sergeant Major Williams. They reported around Magaga Plateau that a considerable number of Zulus had gathered, but they were out of rifle range. This force stretched out for about 2 miles, thousands of them. But this was counter to other reports both Pulleine and Durnford had received. They'd also gotten word that around 6,000 Zulus were near Nkutu Ridge, possibly heading to Chelmsford. This greatly intrigued Durnford. He said, quote,
Well, my idea is that wherever Zulus appear, we ought to attack.
Durnford called for 2 lieutenants, Charles Raw and J.A. Roberts, both under Captain Shepstone's command. They were to take their 2 troops of Zikale horse, Natal Native horse, and head toward Nigwabini Valley. Durnford would lead the remaining Imperial and NNH units to their right. They would link up somewhere in the middle, having either driven back these Zulus or successfully scouted the area. Pulleine reminded Durnford of Chelmsford's orders to defend the camp. This caused an argument, seeing as Durnford had just told Pulleine that he wouldn't take command of Isandlwana Camp, but now seemed eager to do so. In fact, Durnford requested Pulleine to give him 2 additional companies of the 24th Regiment of Foot to accompany him. This was a total breach of protocol. Durnford then clarified, no, the infantry would not join him. They would only slow his cavalry down. Instead, they would form a protective line to support his cavalry if needed. Pulleine was not convinced, and since Durnford had not assumed command of Isandlwana Camp, he refused. They'd now taken this argument outside. Lieutenant Melville, and Pulleine's aide-de-camp, voiced his frustrations. Quote,
Colonel, I really do not think Colonel Pulleine would be doing right to send any men out of the camp when his orders were to defend the camp.
Durnford grumbled, then mounted his horse, moving toward his men. Just then, the rocket battery arrived, they being under the command of Major Francis Bradfoot Russell. He must have been frustrated seeing Durnford already remounting his cavalry to leave, while he'd just gotten there. One of Pulleine's staff informed Russell that Durnford was pursuing a column of 6,000 Zulus east of camp. Russell had been ordered to accompany Durnford, and they would have no choice but to follow. Russell voiced his frustration that Durnford was too eager for a fight. He'd already split apart his No. 2 column, in much the same way Chelmsford had split the No. 3. Russell's small number of NNC were also exhausted and hungry. Riding off to fight the Zulu wouldn't do. But Durnford had none of this. He appears to have seen a chance for glory, redemption from his defeat at Bushman's Pass in 1873, the battle where Durnford lost the use of his left arm. He informed Russell to get his wagons moving and to pursue Durnford with all haste. But he wouldn't wait. No one was going to steal another chance for Durnford to redeem himself. And with that, Durnford called his cavalry forward, and they strode out of camp. Pulleine then made a fateful decision. With the Zulus not appearing, he recalled the men once again. Maybe now they could actually get their meal. The Natal Native Horse troops, led by Lieutenants Raw and Roberts, were all exhausted. The previous night, they camped upon the Magaga Knoll. Here, they were harassed by Zulu skirmishers all night, though it mainly amounted to jeers and calls from the darkness. After 20 minutes of riding, they stumbled across some cattle. They then moved closer, investigating, only to discover some young Zulu boys were wrangling them. Raw sent his NNH ahead of him, stayed behind with Captain Shepstone. In his formation, the Zulus successfully evaded the cavalry for around 5 miles, Raw treating this as a sport, while Shepstone appeared more practical, he being the son of Theophilus Shepstone, who specialized in native affairs across South Africa. Some of Raw's troop killed a few of these Zulus, most of them no older than 12 years old.
But still no sign of the Zulu army. Perhaps those scouts from earlier had merely seen some shadows, or more likely they exaggerated. But those young Zulus and their cattle were definitely heading somewhere. And the further the British pursued them, the more likely they'd find something worth a full skirmish. Because a full skirmish is exactly what Raw wanted. He wanted a fight, and he'd soon get it.
Meanwhile, Major Russell continued to struggle through the rugged terrain with his rocket battery. Durnford had ridden around the right of Conical Hill in his pursuit of the Zulus, and Russell had no hopes of keeping pace. Instead of moving as Durnford did, he traversed the left of Conical Hill, and perhaps would intercept Durnford on the other side. A horseman of the NNH rode up to Raw and Shepstone, clearly disturbed. They wondered why, and the man pointed behind them. Shepstone and Raw had to see something, and to see something quick. Together they rode further on, where the rest of Raw's troops had stopped, though they remained mounted atop a rolling hill. Like the NNH, both Raw and Shepstone were stopped in their tracks. Raw had been hoping for a fight. His moment had come. There below them, stretched out for what seemed miles, were 15,000 Zulus. As one eyewitness wrote, quote,
We saw the Zulus, like ants in front of us, in perfect order, as quiet as mice, and stretched across an even line.
Shepstone knew exactly what they were looking at. This was the Zulu army. All of it. This is what Chelmsford thought he was pursuing. This is what now was marching toward Isandlwana Camp, and now the Zulus saw them. The Zulus all rose in one tense moment, and a single voice could be heard from the valley. Raw immediately asked for a rider to warn Lieutenant Roberts, and to tell them to turn about immediately, and Shepstone spurred his horse. He would ride back to Isandlwana Camp and hopefully warn Pulleine before it was too late. Raw stayed back, ordered his men into line. They all aimed their carbines, then volleyed, some Zulus falling. Raw then waved his arm, retiring his men, each riding with all haste until stopping, turning, their carbines reloaded. And another volley. Then another, rinse and repeat. One of Shepstone's Zakale horsemen recalled, quote,
The distance apart from the two bodies, Roberts and Raw, was about a half a mile. We saw a handful, not many, of Zulus, who kept running from us. All of a sudden, just as Mr. Shepstone joined me on the crest of a ridge, the army of Zulus sprung up 15,000 men.
The Battle of Isandlwana had begun. Ntshingwayo was resting toward the left of the chest, where he heard a mighty call of Ustu. He immediately regained himself, felt panic, as he heard 2/3 of the Zulu army was suddenly moving and seemingly charging ahead. Then came some gunfire from above, those of Lieutenant Raw's NNH. No, they were to attack tomorrow. There was no order whatsoever. He then called his second, Makun Mangwana, to help him call the stampede of his own warriors. The Zulus were riled up, high on narcotics, and now attacking in force having been spotted by the redcoats. But to the Zulus' credit, despite the chaotic start, their discipline did pay off. While at first a giant black mass, the individual commanders, the Indunas, were quick to act. This resulted in the Zulus forming on the march, and it happened quickly and efficiently. They knew where to go and what their missions were. There was no stopping the Zulus from attacking now, and Ntshingwayo saw the writing on the wall. With the chest and horns fully engaged, he spoke to Dabluamanzi, the commander of the loins. They were to swing around Isandlwana Hill, and as the right horn converged on the redcoats' rear, the loins would cut off anyone trying to retreat towards Rorke's drift. Major Russell and his rocket battery kept moving left of Conical Hill, but he stopped when the sound of gunfire changed. It seemed Durnford had been correct, and the sounds were coming somewhere to Russell's left. He rode up ahead and found two riders storming in his direction. The two men were on their way back to camp, having seen the Zulu horde now rapidly heading their way. Russell didn't get much more out of them, looked back to his team, had them prepare for a fight. But he rode further away, had to see for himself, rode with haste up the shaly hill. He just crested the summit when the Zulus fell upon him, all screaming and chanting, singing their war songs. So he spurred his horse around and back toward the rocket battery. "Action front!" he screamed. This meant little to his native escorts, but everything to those in the Royal Artillery. They immediately prepared their rockets, and fired 2 times, the weapons creating a high-pitched shrill as it flew overhead. These were highly inaccurate, but there were so many Zulus it didn't really matter. Both explosions struck the horde in the middle, and screams followed, wounded falling, bits and pieces of Zulu body parts flying out. Russell drew his sword, began directing his NNC guard as the Rocketeers prepared another round. But he heard gunfire now, not his own. Saw Zulu skirmishers ahead of the main column. They were armed with muskets, breech-loaders, anything they could get their hands on, and were firing wildly, viciously, the bullets whizzing past Russell's head. He tried to find cover, but felt a sharp pain now. Spun, the Major falling over, having been shot. The sight of Russell falling panicked the NNC, and they dispersed, leaving the soldiers of the rocket battery to fend for themselves. They did not last long, firing only a few shots with their guns before the Zulu horn crashed into them. Assegais were thrust forward, stabbing the redcoats, disemboweling them, and slaughtering most of the horses. This included Major Russell. Pulleine was reading an order he just received from Chelmsford from Captain Alan Gardner and Major Stuart Smith. Pulleine was to strike camp and march east immediately to join the rest of No.3 Column. This was the order he'd been waiting for, but then he heard the gunfire and what he thought was an explosion. He looked through his telescope and was shocked to see a line of retreating cavalry. A rapidly approaching horse followed, and riding it was Captain George Shepstone. Pulleine didn't expect to see him. Captain George Shepstone reached Pulleine, dismounted, was out of breath. He said, quote,
"I'm not an alarmist, sir, but the Zulus are in such black masses over there, such long lines that you'll have to give us all the assistance you can. They are fast driving our men this way."
So Pulleine turned to Captain Gardner, and he scribbled down a response. Quote,
Staff officer, heavy firing to the left of our camp. Cannot move camp at present.
Gardner saluted, agreeing with Pulleine's assessment, and rode off toward Chelmsford. Pulleine then sounded the alert. Lieutenant Curling wrote of the scene, quote,
"Not one of us dreamt that there was the least danger, and all we hoped for was the fight might come off before Chelmsford returned."
Captain Gardner, meanwhile, was now a good distance from the camp. He reread Pulleine's note and decided to elaborate upon it. This is what Chelmsford would read, and neither appeared to convey the seriousness of their current predicament. The vedettes on Conical Hill could see the dark mass of Zulus coming straight for them. Looked to the right, could also see Durnford's column still riding towards Isandlwana Hill. He was heading straight into the whole column of Zulus. They sent runners immediately, each soaring down the hills on horseback and riding toward Durnford before it was too late. They arrived, saluted, stopping Durnford. Together they begged the colonel to return to camp, and it was clear Durnford was about to be cut off and surrounded. Durnford wasn't sure what to make of this. He hadn't heard any fighting to his left, other than some pot shots. So he grabbed one of his captains, asked where Major Russell was. The captain only knew Russell was a long ways back. But what about Raw and Roberts? Had they returned? No one knew. Durnford growled in frustration, probably realizing he'd spread his column far too thin, as Russell had warned. But he defiantly spun his horse, the others watching.
The enemy can't surround us, and if they do, we will cut our way through them.
Not long after, the Zulu vanguard appeared, many armed with outdated guns. They moved in silence, around 1,500 yards away, spotted Durnford's cavalry. They answered with a cheer and a loose volley, their shots wildly inaccurate, but no less alarming. They would fire, load, advance, then fire again. A bullet whizzed by Durnford's head, and he called for 6 men of his NNH, all fast riders. He told them to warn Chelmsford of what was happening, and that he was to move back to Isandlwana quickly. His riders understood, saluted, then rode off to the southeast.
Durnford laid it out bluntly. There's no way his 100 riders could stop the Zulus, but they could delay them and buy Chelmsford time to return to Isandlwana and reinforce the camp.
He ordered them to dismount, and at once they leapt down from their horses and formed a skirmish line. Take aim. Fire. Their first volley. Reload. Another. More Zulus began falling, most wounded, the horde continuing forward and paying them no mind. Durnford ordered his men to remount, and they obeyed without missing a beat. They then retired around 400 yards, turned, and repeated their earlier process, dismounting, firing a few volleys, then remounting to withdraw a little more. Durnford's horsemen acted splendidly, and with the expertise only discipline and proper training could achieve. Durnford must have been loving this. Muston and Cavaye, and Lieutenant Edward Dyson's men, looked to their west, saw churned-up dust. They could now see the Zulu right horn, though they weren't sure of it at the time. All they knew was that thousands of Zulus were marching in a flanking movement toward the rear of Isandlwana. Together, they fired several volleys, but these Zulus were just out of range of the Martini Henry. They then watched as Lieutenant Roberts and Raw's NNH scurry back to Isandlwana Camp and around the mountain's spur. Even with the sight of gunfire, the Zulus were well disciplined. Many wanted to turn and fight the nearby redcoats, but didn't. They knew their mission, so they ignored the British, kept moving south to wrap themselves around the redcoats' primary escape route. Captain Muston could tell this was what was happening, but there was nothing either Cavaye or he could do. They ordered their companies to cease fire. Lieutenant Melville then arrived, sent by Pulleine. The Zulus had been spotted, now heading directly for camp, and both companies were to return immediately and form the left part of the line. Both captains obeyed. But if they marched off the hill, the right horn would be left without eyes. But what of the Zulu Chest advancing directly on the camp's left? The thin red line needed all the firepower it could get. They now would march, in good order, back into Isandlwana Camp and off the mountain. Lieutenants Robert and Raw followed them, placing their NNH to their left. Captain Reginald Younghusband's C Company was now the closest to Isandlwana Hill, and were taking up position. Many were annoyed, this being the third time they'd been called into formation today, but now they knew this was the real deal. Did they know the entire Zulu army was marching toward them? Likely not. But their spirits were high. In fact, most of the 24th seemed jovial as the fight approached. Younghusband could likely see both Companies E and F returning to what was developing into the main British battle line. Seeing them marching off the northern end of the hill, he took note. Perhaps atop the hill would make a good defendable position.
But E and F Company were positioning themselves pretty far off to Younghusband's right, leaving a larger than comfortable gap between them. Luckily, Captain Shepstone's NNH filled these gaps. The Zulus were first heard before appearing well ahead of Isandlwana Camp. The black mass poured over the ridge to the front and right, and the British soldiers prepared themselves. Chelmsford had been dreadfully wrong, and Pulleine knew it. He established a half-ring around the north and east sides of Isandlwana Camp. The British were known for their thin red lines, but today, the thin red line would be especially thin. All companies stood around 200 yards from each other, and in two ranks. The man in front kneeled, while the man behind him stood. Each man from each company stood around 3 to 4 yards apart from the man to his left and right, creating a large skirmish formation. Going from left to right, first was Captain Younghusband's C Company, consisting of around 90 soldiers. To his right were NNH and mounted troops, commanded by Lieutenants Raw and Roberts. Captains Mostyn and Lieutenant Cavaye's F and E companies were to the right of them, having just made their way back into camp. To the northeast, first came Lieutenant Porteous's A Company. To his right were the 2 mountain guns led by Lieutenant Curling. To the east were Captain Wardell's H Company, and to his right was Lieutenant Charles Pope's G Company. There were also a few companies of NNC under command of Commandant Rupert Lonsdale. In the morning, he'd split his force. Nearly 2/3 were with Chelmsford, as was Rupert. But the remaining third was near Isandlwana Camp, under command of Captain James Lonsdale III. Captain Robert Bradstreet had also sent his Newcastle mounted rifles toward the Nyongane Donga, which helped secure the camp's right flank. But even this was too far out, and his forces spread shockingly thin. Now they could see just how many Zulus they faced, and the mood rapidly changed from relaxed to alarmed. It was apparent that Pulleine and Durnford only had around 1,500 men at most, and this was the Zulu army. At least 15,000 men. Lieutenant Henry Curling, having just set up his 2 guns, could see the oncoming Zulu mass, swarming about as if a stirred beehive. He looked through his binoculars, knew the enemy would soon be in range of his 7-pounder cannons. They moved out once orders came from Lieutenant Melville straight from Pulleine. Commandant Rupert Lonsdale was riding back to camp from the southeast. He had ridden ahead of his Natal Native Contingent, which was in the process of marching back to camp as well. He'd fallen off his horse in the days prior, likely had a concussion or an at least heat stroke. Like his men, he was tired and hungry, which didn't help his physical condition. He had no idea what was currently happening in camp, but could hear gunshots. Rumors were abound that Zulu skirmishers might attack the camp, but Lonsdale thought little of it. He could make out the British red tunics, saw them in formation, felt reassured that all was well. The Zulu Chest was at 3,200 yards out, and now in range of the 7-pounder muzzleloaders. Curling gave the first order to fire. Both guns answered, and the shells exploded in the middle of the oncoming horde. The troops, having seen this, began to cheer, both cannons now in the process of reloading. Curling's guns began doing a great deal of damage to these Zulus. Notably, there were huts and dongas hundreds of warriors sought shelter in. He targeted those spots, sending momentary panic through the Zulu lines. But the Zulus kept coming, and were rapidly approaching the range of infantry rifles. As the cannons roared, Pulleine watched his exposed right flank. He knew Durnford was out there somewhere, and remembered what was said. Should Durnford run into trouble, he expected Pulleine to support him. Perhaps this might explain why the British line was spread so thin and for so long. Keeping Captain Wardell's H Company and Lieutenant Pope's G Company so far away might have been more to support Durnford than to support the camp. But now gunfire came from that direction. A lot of it. Volleys. Hearing this likely justified Pulleine's decision, or lack thereof.
The fighting withdrawal had successfully slowed the Zulu left horn, but it didn't stop it. They had now established the two troops in rotating volleys. Durnford looked about, heard someone shout to him, the man pointing to the left. Zulus were there, rapidly moving downward in the hopes of cutting Durnford off from Pulleine's right flank. He spurred his horse, called for a full retreat, then led the way, looking for a place where they could redeploy and establish their new firing line.
As they rode, they were coming quickly upon the Nyongane Donga, Lieutenant Charles Pope's G Company and Captain Bradstreet's mounted rifles. This, in theory, should fill the thin gap that helped secure Pulleine's right flank. This was a 3 to 4 foot deep line, and this is where Durnford would make his stand. The troops dismounted, with the NNH taking the best position. The horse holders were instructed to hide in the donga, protected from Zulu fire. One troop skirmished out, putting up a constant stream of independent fire both to the front and left. The other troop crouched in the donga itself, and their sergeant began ordering rapid volleys to help check the Zulu advance. This volley fire was so great, the oncoming Zulus stopped and took to ground. This greatly pleased Durnford, who then looked to his skirmish troop. They were still at the independent, picking off the Zulus trying to cut them off. The second troop then pivoted their fire to support the skirmishers, having the intended effect. The increased firepower began checking that position of the left horn. Yes, Durnford concluded, this was a good spot. He began riding up and down the firing line, complimenting his boys, laughing at the Zulus, and encouraging his men. And his men listened, their morale now bolstered, their aim improving. Now feeling confident his men could hold, Durnford is said to have ridden into camp to confer with Pulleine. What they discussed is unknown, but likely about their strategic situation. Durnford then rode back to his men, just as the main British firing line opened up with one massive volley. The main firing line. The Zulus had maintained their advance, all charging in a mad dash straight for Pulleine's main battle line. With the full Zulu Chest now in view, everyone from the rank and file to the highest-ranking officer understood the odds they now faced. This was now a fight for survival. But the fiercest warriors of Africa were now facing the most disciplined army of Europe. Finally, the Zulus reached the 600-yard mark, the max range for the Martini Henry rifle. And true to form, the British began their waves of volley fire. And unlike the muskets of old, these breech loaders were deadly in their accuracy. And the Zulus were just about to discover how deadly. Major Stewart of the Royal Artillery arrived. Curling had been doing a good job thus far, the man saluting. Stewart now took command of the two cannons, Curling stepping back, feeling slighted of his chance to shine. But by now the Zulus had maneuvered themselves into a much favorable position, making the two cannons less effective. The Zulu warriors grew smart of the gunners' repetition. The moment their observers would see the gunners step away from the cannons to shoot, the Zulus would scatter about. As a British soldier noted, quote, "There was no confusion or hurry in these movements of theirs, but all was done as though they had been drilled to do it. High praise indeed." But much to the soldiers' horror, despite the casualties they were inflicting, the Zulus just kept coming. The British kept up their fire, one volley after the other. At around 150 yards, the Martini Henry proved its most deadly. So much so that with another volley, the oncoming Zulu warriors paused and didn't dare take one step forward. They withdrew, but only a few yards, quickly finding cover. The British, seeing this, cheered, some laughing, knowing they just checked the Zulu onslaught. But if they were to let up anywhere, even for an instant, the Zulus would take advantage of this weakness and overwhelm them. They weren't out of the woods yet. But in their excitement, the British had given themselves tunnel vision. Pulleine and almost all of his command had forgotten just how the Zulus fought, the horns of the buffalo. For now, the British soldiers began to relax, many laughing and taunting, as Captain Edward Essex recalled, quote,
"I was surprised how relaxed the men in the ranks were, loading as fast as they could and firing into the dense black masses that pressed in on them. The men were laughing and chatting. and obviously thought they were giving the Zulus an awful hammering.
Durnford had remained put, shooting volley after volley into the Zulu left horn. Men began shouting now. They were low on ammo. Durnford checked his pistol rounds and discovered that he was too, called to one of his riders from his NNH, sent them off to Isandlwana and bring forward ammunition. However, these men didn't know the location of their own ammunition reserves, but Durnford instructed them to do their best, then sent them off. The guns had also begun to overheat, a common problem especially for the Martini Henrys. One sergeant major is said to have seen a soldier run up to Durnford, the cartridge sticking and leaving his gun useless. Durnford grabbed it, then propped the carbine between his knees. With only his one hand, he freed the cartridge, then handed it back to the soldier. Upon arriving in camp, Durnford's riders couldn't find the reserve ammo, so they did the next best thing, galloping to the nearest quartermaster. Meanwhile, the infantry were volleying one after the other off to the north, the smoke carrying into camp. They found the quartermaster handing ammunition slowly out to runners from companies of the 1st 24th. They asked for ammo, but this quartermaster had none of it. These NNH were black. All the quartermaster seemed to be concerned about were the white officers and NCOs. His responsibility was to his own company, the 1st 24th, not Durnford's. Just then, a massive war cry rang up from the center, and the buffalo's chest had all rose and charged at once. Durnford fired another volley, looking back toward camp. He spurred his horse, galloped along the line, was distressed his reserved ammunition hadn't arrived. He'd been lucky thus far, and knew it too. Lieutenant Pope's attention was on the same horn driving against Durnford and Bradstreet. Someone tapped his shoulder, pointing behind him. Pope turned, could see Zulus had slipped between Durnford and he. And further behind that were more Zulu warriors moving past the Nyongane Dunga and having all but free access to the right side of Isandlwana Camp. He called his men to cease fire, had them rise, then do a right wheel. He needed to provide Durnford covering fire so the cavalry could escape and establish a new defensive line. This would prevent the Zulus from overtaking the flanks. So he had his men ready to move toward Durnford's aid. Simultaneously, Durnford's riders returned with no ammunition at all, much to his dismay. He then watched the flanks again, could see the Zulus charging around his right, ready to swoop around and cut off his exposed flank. And in the process, they'd cut his men to pieces. He hadn't a choice being outflanked and out of ammunition, turned around and called his men to mount their horses. He was going to have to abandon the Dunga, arguably the best ground of the battlefield. It wasn't just Durnford's men running low on ammunition, too. The main firing line was now facing a similar peril to the cavalry. Troops would reach into their ammunition pouch, having started with somewhere around 50 rounds, only to find them terrifyingly empty. Runners began being dispatched to the rear seeking their quartermaster. Ammunition began being distributed, which were kept in thick wooden boxes designed to be popped open usually with a bayonet. But the main firing lines were too far away. To maintain their rate of fire, the quartermaster needed to move his wagons closer, or the lines would need to be retracted. These options seemed lost to Lieutenant Colonel Pulleine. He'd given no order either way thus far in the battle, and that would prove disastrous for what's coming. Pulleine hadn't been idle during this perilous moment. He looked through his binoculars and could see exactly what Lieutenant Pope had. He called for Lieutenant Melville, gave clear instructions that one of Henry Curling's guns was to turn about and cover Durnford for a fallback. They were now under command of Major Stuart Smith, but in doing so he failed to notice Lieutenant Pope's maneuvering. The first shots from Smith's second cannon began falling toward Durnford's direction. Shrapnel flew about, slicing massive holes through the Zulu lines. With almost no ammunition left, Durnford saw his opportunity, ordered one last volley, then retreat. They then galloped straight for camp. Pope ordered his men to advance, his intentions well, but the Zulus had found their opportunity to strike. The redcoats now had a weak point, and true to form,
they were about to exploit it. With Pope having moving southward, a huge gap was left between him and Captain Wardell's H Company. Pope arrived exactly where he intended to be, but didn't find Durnford at all. He hadn't long to wait before he discovered the magnitude of his mistake. Durnford hadn't just fallen back, but he'd retreated all the way to camp. Pope probably was hoping Durnford would stay close and secure the long gaps between G and H Company. This left Pope all by himself. He tried to act quickly, to march back to his original position, to rectify his error, but it was too late. A Zulu shout of "Ustu" was heard, and the Zulu left horn, acting as if a hive mind, surrounded Pope, so the spectacled lieutenant ordered the only thing he could.
Form square!
The British right flank had just been turned.
It is important for me to interject myself during these moments of the battle. Accounts from this time forward vary wildly, both in primary and secondary sources. Know that I've tried my best to discern this portion of the battle, but there's a little more inferencing here and conjecture than I normally like. All sources of which are available in the description below, and you will also see them displayed with a page number at the bottom of your screen, as I've been doing throughout the rest of this documentary.
Runners came from Cavaye and Mostyn. One of them was Captain Edward Essex. To their shock, the quartermaster hadn't done a thing to properly supply the firing lines. There were men scattered about the tents and by the wagon park. Essex, belonging to the 2nd 24th, found his own quartermaster, Edward Bloomfield. They just started drawing up a plan when a stray Zulu bullet struck Bloomfield and killed him. They found a mule hooked to a cart, and Essex began loading the wagon full of Martini Henry ammo. In rode Colonel Durnford. With his retreat, he was well aware of how exposed he'd left the camp's right flank, namely that of Lieutenant Pope. The moment he arrived, he set his men to gather ammunition, while he sought out Colonel Pulleine. Instead, he found Captain Essex.
You, collect all the troops together. Hold the enemy in check.
Just then, they heard a massive Zulu cry, not to their right, but toward the center. To the front, the Zulu Chest continued to hunker down from British volley fire. Upon a hill to the rear, Ntshingwayo watched in frustration. It is unknown if he knew of the left horn's success, but he needed to get the chest up and moving again. One of the Zulu Zub-chiefs could see the predicament as well. He ran off the hill and right toward his warriors, exposing himself to a great deal of fire. His name was
Mekozana Kamvunlana.
His men saw him, the man running back and forth, much to Ntshingwayo's glee, and the warriors were beginning to take stock, but were too afraid once they heard the crack of volley fire. With this volley,
Mekozana
was shot dead. This suddenly emboldened his warriors, seeing one of their leaders so bravely urging them forward, and they doing nothing, filled the ranks with shame, and this shame rapidly morphed into a furious anger. First, one Zulu rose, then another, and one loud cry could be heard. This cry carried through the ranks, the warriors rising up now as a single mass and charging in spite of British volley fire. This is exactly what Ntshingwayo wanted. These Zulus now charged directly into Captain Cavaye and Mostyn's companies. With almost all their ammunition spent, there was little to stop these warriors now craving revenge, and both companies began to falter and withdraw. Colonel Pulleine, having eluded Colonel Durnford, could see this danger. Their current position was no longer tenable, and he called for his bugler. The order was given to withdraw back into camp, and the sound traveled over the battlefield. But this proved to be exactly what the Zulus wanted. Had Pulleine acted sooner, there would have been more time to withdraw and keep the Zulus pinned, but now the Zulus were much closer, and the time needed to maintain formation minuscule. All along the Zulu Chest they rose, seeing the British line faltering in a withdrawal. charging ahead at a rapid pace. Lieutenant Curling and Major Smith were taken aback by this sudden rush and ordered the two guns changed to canister. The gunners obeyed, and the two cannons fired simultaneously, cutting a huge hole straight through the Zulu lines. But those gaps were quickly filled by more warriors, their numbers seeming unending. Curling recalled, quote,
"We limbered up at once, but were hardly in time as the Zulus were on us at once. We trotted off to the camp thinking to take up another position, but found it in the possession of the enemy, who were killing the men as they ran out of their tents. We went right through the tents and out the other side, losing nearly all the gunners in doing so, and one of the two sergeants."
The other companies tried to pull back, but some were hit from behind, unaware of the right flank collapsing. Others were nearly overwhelmed by the swiftness of the Zulu Chest, leaving the redcoats in a panic, seeking refuge in the tents. These tents soon proved a great problem for any officer trying to organize a defense, as they broke up what could have been a decently defendable position. Thus, the companies couldn't form whatsoever, and instead of large organized perimeters, there were now disorganized, smaller defensive squares forming all across the camp. Meanwhile, the wagon park was in full panic. Men on horses were running, including the quartermaster of the first 24. It was all in vain, as anyone trying to make it around Isandlwana and into the saddle were also doomed. Some Natal Native Contingent recalled looking to the west, seeing a square of British soldiers kneeling and fighting, cut off from the rest of camp. This was Lieutenant Pope's G Company, now on their own, and slowly trying to fight their way closer to their comrades. Pope now fought alongside his second-in-command, Lieutenant Frederick Goodwin Austin. Both men wore glasses, and were blatantly remembered by the Zulus attacking them, standing on either side of the square, trying to keep their men organized and tight together. But the Zulus had come armed with muskets and rifles. Pope was suddenly shot in the neck, and he held his wound. It was only a graze. But then came another shot, hitting his leg, sending the lieutenant toppling over. Zulus were now pushing through the square, stabbing anyone in their way, charging for Pope now. He emptied his pistol, soon ran out, threw it at an oncoming warrior. Said Zulu retaliated by tossing his assegai like a javelin, and it pierced Pope's chest. But it didn't kill him. He tried in vain to free the assegai, almost succeeding, but more Zulus fell upon him, stabbing, disemboweling him, killing him. Goodwin Austin had tried to intervene, but was also killed by those same Zulus. Pope's G Company now crumbled, and it was a free-for-all. Every man for himself in a mad dash to camp. Most wouldn't make it far. Durnford still hadn't found Pulleine anywhere, and he rode back to his cavalry. Everything had fallen apart, the Zulus entering camp. Much of the NNH had escaped by now, pushing through the camp and riding toward Fugitives' Drift. Some NCOs suggested Durnford leave instead, but to Durnford's credit, he wasn't going to do that. He chose to fight and die with his remaining men, instead of running away to save himself. With Durnford were some scattered members of the Natal Native Contingent, troops Durnford held personally responsible for his loss at Bushman's Pass. Yet here they were, now fighting side by side. Durnford didn't protest, and he rallied all these different men to a better defensible position, while never dismounting his horse. He likely wanted others to see him, for them to see some semblance of leadership, but it would all be in vain. There came a new Zulu chant now, but not in the camp nor his right flank, but to the left. The right horn had appeared. Lieutenant Henry Curling's guns were in the saddle, where he felt he'd be safe to withdraw back toward Rorke's Drift. Instead, he was met by yet another horde of Zulu warriors, seemingly appearing out of nowhere. This was the forgotten right horn, which appeared at the worst possible moment for the British. Curling's men had no choice but to use Fugitives' Trail, a rugged path further south of Isandlwana. Captain Younghusband's C Company, still holding the left British flank, was continuing their fire on the Zulu Chest,
However, one of the soldiers on the furthest flank began pointing to the rear. Captain Younghusband was hoping to see reinforcements coming from Rorke's Drift, or possibly Chelmsford, but all he saw were more Zulus. They were rapidly coming upon the wagon park behind the camp. The terror he must have felt. Younghusband shouted to his men, had them cease firing and reload. Seeing the danger, he called for his company to march up the northern slopes of Isandlwana, which greatly enhanced his field of fire. Meanwhile, in camp, Durnford's men were putting up a stubborn fight. He had lost his horse, perhaps killed by a Zulu musket or assegai. He cried out for those nearest to him to form square. Quickly, he would make his final stand here, at the edge of the stone kopje. By him were around 50 other men, a hodgepodge of different troops from different companies, both imperial and colonial. He called out to them, and most turned to join his square. Many of these were stragglers from Lieutenant Pope's G Company. It is here the sun grew dark, a shadow casting itself over Isandlwana. It was the solar eclipse, perfectly timed, and seen as a good omen for the Zulus. It fueled their already boiling bloodlust, and they would call it the Day of the Dead Moon. Durnford could now hear Zulu cries, saw the right horn rounding the mountain. Until now, he'd probably held a semblance of hope for his own survival. But now seeing the right horn swooping in and cutting off almost every line of retreat, he realized he was doomed. With the solar eclipse underway, Durnford had an idea. If he could hold his own, even for just a half hour, and keep the horns from linking, survivors could possibly escape. He found Captain Shepstone, gave him around 30 men. Upon Shepstone's arrival, Younghusband was already on the move up the northern side of Isandlwana. He'd gathered all the men he could, most wounded. Along the way, he grabbed a few stranded cavalry from both Roberts' and Raw's command, who had lost their horses. Raw had escaped Isandlwana at some point, though Roberts had been killed sometime earlier. But it didn't matter what company or battalion they came from. If they had a gun, they'd be useful. Durnford took his remaining troops and formed them in front of the saddle. He had them form a tight circle, shoulder to shoulder, and he poured fire into the surrounding Zulus. Zulu warriors recalled seeing a one-armed Induna, certainly Durnford, repeatedly calling for volley fire, over and over. He would hold until the last. This event is full of skepticism. In truth, no one really knows what happened here, and there are many testimonies and many eyewitnesses and historians alike who actually don't really believe Pulleine was even alive to give Melville and Coghill the colors. And the contradictions between sources here are literally endless. So take what I'm about to say with a massive grain of salt. For Lieutenant Colonel Pulleine's faults during the battle, cowardice was not one of them. Like so many officers at Isandlwana, there was no evidence showing Pulleine made any attempts whatsoever to flee for safety, even though he had ample opportunity to do so. As the Zulus closed upon camp, the writing was clear on the wall. They'd lost. It was now time to save the colors. Pulleine mounted a horse, grabbed Lieutenant Melville of the 1st 24th and Lieutenant Neville Coghill from the 2nd 24th. They rode toward the center of camp, successfully evading the Zulus and moving just behind Durnford Square. Unfortunately, neither man appeared to see each other through the chaos. But Pulleine had an objective. The three men entered the guard tent of the 1st Battalion of the 24th Regiment. They found the Queen's colors safely packed in a black leather box. Next, they found Colonel Glynn's tent and retrieved the colors of the 2nd Battalion. Pulleine then told Melville and Coghill to ride toward Rorke's Drift to save the colors. Both lieutenants saluted Pulleine, securing the protective cases to their horses, then galloping off with all haste. Lieutenant Curling recalled seeing Melville and Coghill in their escape. He asked if they could rally some men to make a stand, but Coghill said there was no hope. They then galloped off and toward the Buffalo River. At this point, Lieutenant Curling had lost Major Stuart Smith, and soon his guns too.
that the Zulus were giving chase and the cannons were slowing them down. So they abandoned them, and Curling would never see Major Stuart Smith alive again. Pulleine went back to his own tent and entered. There, hands shaking with fear, he sat behind his table and readied a pen and paper. He began writing a letter, its contents unknown, but likely either a report for Chelmsford about his final moments, or a letter to his wife. But before he could finish, in came a young Zulu warrior. Pistol nearby, Pulleine picked it up and fired, wounding the Zulu in the neck, though it didn't kill him. The wounded Zulu leapt over the desk and stabbed Pulleine repeatedly in the chest with his assegai, and Pulleine fell from his chair, lifeless. Durnford's last stand. The primary British body tried to maintain formation, it being their best defense with no entrenchments or laager. But the camp tents made this nearly impossible, and the Zulus took full advantage of it. One poor redcoat tried to hide himself in a nearby tent, but the Zulus had seen him, and instead of entering to kill him, they simply sliced and stabbed their way through the canvas. They heard a bloody scream, and red splattered across it. More and more of this happened as the Zulus showed no mercy to the invading white army. It didn't matter if they were sick, wounded, or trying to surrender. Durnford had drawn his pistol. He stood behind his men, aiming and firing. All of them had by now tossed their carbines, their ammunition long gone, and they stood in a tight square, shoulder to shoulder, now using their own pistols. One of them was Captain Bradstreet. Durnford called, rallied them, saw a Zulu, fired, killed him. What was left of G Company were now using their bayonets, each thick with blood and guts. Others were using the butts of their rifles, some so much the wood had begun to split. There were also a few others from the 1st Battalion here as well, with some Natal Mounted Police, Carbineers, and some NNC. This one-armed officer was said to have shot another 4 or 5 Zulus in the square before he'd run out of ammunition. He began using the butt of a carbine to strike away the Zulu foe. But the Zulus kept coming, getting closer and closer, and now Durnford's square had become 2 short lines, each man back to back. When their pistols were empty, they drew their knives. One warrior recalled,
Doom doom went his revolver as he was firing from right to left, and I came beside him and struck my assegai under his right arm, pushing it through his body until it came out between his ribs on the left side. As soon as he fell, I pulled the assegai out and slit his stomach, so I knew he should not shoot any more of my people.
It is unlikely this Zulu referred to Durnford, but it was in this line where Durnford fell. For all his faults, the colonel died fighting side by side with his men, his body laying lifeless in the middle of where he'd made his last stand. The Zulu kept up the pursuit of the fleeing British forces all the way to the Buffalo River. They showed no mercy, killing anyone and anything they saw. This included the horses and cattle. Anyone who begged for mercy received none. How could they? One Zulu warrior recalled, quote,
How can we give mercy when you have come to us to take away our country and eat us up?
James Brickhill described the terrifying scene.
No path, no track, boulders everywhere. On we were borne, now into some dry torrent bed, now weaving our way amongst trees of stunted growth. Our way was already strewn with shields, assegais, blankets, hats, clothing of all description, guns, ammunition belts, saddles, revolvers, and I do not know what. One riderless horse then ran up alongside of me. I caught and gave to a poor soldier, who was struggling along on foot, but he had scarcely mounted before he was knocked down by a Zulu bullet.
Coghill and Melville had to split apart when faced with dozens of angry Zulus, but closer to the buffalo they managed to relink. Coghill's horse had been horribly wounded by a spear, though they continued together. They tried to traverse down a rocky cliff and toward the Buffalo River. Many soldiers were already trying to cross as well, some swept away,
most stabbed or shot by oncoming Zulus. Both Coghill and Melville would also meet their fate here, the exact happenings of their demise greatly debated. Either way, both men were posthumously awarded a Victoria Cross. Lieutenant Curling managed to escape the Zulu onslaught on horseback, but only after losing most of his comrades and his commanding officer. He'd been one of only 5 Imperial officers to survive. These are Captains Edward Essex and Alan Gardner, with Lieutenants William Francis Cochrane and Horace Smith Dorian. Around 2:00 p.m. Meanwhile, the exhausted and dizzy Lonsdale had finally reached camp. He'd picked up pace, knowing a larger fight was underway, but he stopped. Too late. The camp was overrun, and now a Zulu warrior had appeared from inside a tent. Lonsdale was charged, and he turned, his vision still hazy, heard more Zulus now, many heading for him and tossing their spears. He could see the dead bodies of his comrades, the Zulus searching the bodies and ransacking the tents. Some were even donning the red tunics taken off of dead soldiers. It was a disaster. Lonsdale spun his horse, shocked by what he'd seen, and rode back toward his battalion. He knew the Zulus were following him for some distance, and he heard gunshots too, bullets whizzing by. But eventually the Zulus tired, and Lonsdale had narrowly escaped being disemboweled. Younghusband's charge. It was as late as 3 p.m., and Younghusband and his men were down to the last round, and the Zulus were closing on them fast. Captain Shepstone lay dead somewhere further below, having been killed by the oncoming Zulus in a vain attempt to hold back the Zulu right horn. The rest of Younghusband's men had made their way effectively up the eastern slopes of Isandlwana.
There were around 60 men with him now,
most of them Imperial soldiers from his C Company. With bayonets fixed, they kept the Zulus at bay thanks to their favorable position and the steep slopes. Men would push Zulus down, stab others, and cover those loading while using their bayonets. One Zulu warrior recalled, quote,
They fought well. A lot of them got upon the steep slope under the cliff behind the camp, and the Zulus could not get at them at all. They were shot or bayoneted as fast as they came up.
The British here were now out of ammunition, including Younghusband. He dropped whatever weapon he held and drew his sword. He knew full well the Zulus would show no mercy, and that this was it. They were all about to die. He shook hands with a few of those nearest to him, thanking them, admiring their tenacity, and they all knew their time had come. At the head of his new formation of British soldiers, Younghusband raised his sword high, told his men to rise and charge bayonets. The men did so, most of them already wounded. They shouted one last battle cry, likely, God save the Queen, and then charged as one into the Zulus. It is here they were killed one by one, stabbed and gored to death by the impressed Zulu warriors. Hamilton Brown had finally found Chelmsford. He'd known the truth, had heard and seen it. Isandlwana had fallen. But Chelmsford didn't believe him. Instead, Chelmsford waved Hamilton Brown away, saying, quote,
How dare you tell me such a falsehood? Get your men into line at once and advance!
Chelmsford was now riding with the 1st Battalion of Commandant Lonsdale's NNC. He and his staff heard a rider approaching, and soon Lonsdale himself came into view. He looked ready to pass out, horribly sunburnt, uniform covered in dust. Lonsdale reached out for help, nearly falling off his horse, but an aide-de-camp caught him. He drank some water, collected himself some, then expressed what he'd seen, a small crowd having gathered. Isandlwana had been overrun. He repeated what Hamilton Brown had said, and even now Chelmsford didn't believe it. Chelmsford said, quote,
But I'd left over 1,000 men to guard the camp.
Only now did Chelmsford position himself to properly see Isandlwana Camp, and only now could he see the devastation, watching the Zulus plunder everything they came across. By 4:00 p.m., the battle had concluded. Colonel Glynn had the surviving men of the 24th turn about and marched back toward Isandlwana. Upon reaching the destroyed camp, bodies everywhere, fires burning, the smell of rotting flesh filling the air, the morale had dropped to an all-time low. This was a disaster of unprecedented magnitude. It was now dark, and the Zulu dawn had reached its end. One soldier recalled, quote,
"The dead were lying in such numbers that we constantly fell over corpses. But whether European or Zulu, it was too dark to see."
When the numbers reached Chelmsford, their losses were over 1,500 men killed, and the Zulu losses, while never officially counted, numbered between 1,000 and 3,000 killed. Chelmsford would send a dispatch to the Secretary of State for War, which were published in the British newspapers on February 10th, 1879. It read, quote,
I regret to report a very disastrous engagement, which took place on the 22nd January between the Zulus and portions of No.3 Column, left to guard the camp about 10 miles in front of Rorke's Drift. The Zulus came down in overwhelming numbers, and in spite of gallant resistance made by 5 companies of the 1st 24th and 1 company of the 2nd 24th, 2 guns, 2 rocket tubes, 104 mounted men, and about 800 natives, they overwhelmed them.
Men looked to the west, could see an ominous orange glow now. It meant only one thing. The Zulus had also attacked Rorke's Drift. A crestfallen Chelmsford believed another disaster had just occurred. In truth, the entire invasion had been a total disaster. But little did Chelmsford know that not only were there many of those at Rorke's Drift still alive, but they had successfully fended off 4,000 Zulus. Nevertheless, Chelmsford ordered a full withdrawal back into Natal. He lost his gamble. Rorke's Drift had 2 thatch buildings and a compound used for holding cattle. Currently, the compound is owned by a Swedish missionary named Otto Witt. Witt leases Rorke's Drift to the British to use as a hospital and storage space. On the onset of the invasion, Witt sent his family away, seeing the danger, but he decided to stay. Witt spoke fluent Zulu, and he acted as an interpreter for the British forces stationed at Rorke's Drift. The British ordered Rorke's Drift converted into a military checkpoint. This is where reinforcements will arrive. The bridges will be built crossing into Zululand, and the wounded and the sick will be sent here as the war continues. It is decided to leave behind 300 men of the Natal Native Contingent to help guard and perform some of the dirty work around Rorke's Drift, while the bulk of the army crossed into Zululand. These forces dressed much like regular Zulus, armed with nothing but shields and spears. They only had a single red band to distinguish them from their Zulu counterparts. It is very easy to see how the Zulus had infiltrated the British army. Unlike their Zulu counterparts, these native contingents were much less eager to fight. Another group to be left at Rorke's Drift was B Company of the 24th Regiment of Foot, consisting of around 80 men under Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead. Meanwhile, Lieutenant John Chard would be left behind with members of the No. 5 Field Company of Royal Engineers to help build the bridge and maintain the pontoon bridges leading into Zululand. Witt's home was soon converted into an outright field hospital, mainly to deal with the sick more than the wounded. This was Africa, after all. You're wearing wool uniforms in easily 100-degree weather. Bugs carry unknown numbers of diseases, and this is an army on the march. Disease is bound to be rife, and like always, it was. These groups of men were under the overall command of Major Henry Spalding, who served as the chief supply officer. They now sat there and watched as the main bulk of the army crossed over the Buffalo River, and the invasion of Zululand had begun. Nothing of note occurred between January 11th and January 22nd, 1879, other than a few skirmishes here and there. Many British officers were growing bored of dealing with the slow logistics and slower than expected movements into Zululand. And also, the Zulus had yet to put up a real fight. In fact, they hadn't seen much of any Zulu movement at all. But that all changed in the mornings and afternoon of January 22nd, 1879. Lieutenant Chard arrived at the pontoon bridges on January 19th and began making repairs. However, he soon received a dispatch that he doesn't quite understand. It appears his sappers, his builders, were needed at Isandlwana, where the bulk of the 24th Regiment of Foot was encamped. He gathers his troop from 5th Company Royal Engineers and rides to Isandlwana as ordered. But he learns he's not needed upon arriving, only his sappers are. And he complies, leaving his men at the main column near Isandlwana. Confused, he looks at his orders, which explicitly state his focus is to be on the Buffalo River's right side, so the British side of the river. So after arriving, he is immediately sent back with only his wagon full of supplies and his driver to construct new defensive positions for the oncoming British reinforcements. Meanwhile, as he leaves his men behind, he spots movement off in the distance. He grabs the nearest NCO and looks through his binoculars to see thousands of Zulus on the move. These hills were full of the brown and white shields as the enemy army marched as one unit. Chard fears that the Zulus might be moving to get between Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, cutting off the main column. He mounted the wagon and rode off to Rorke's Drift as quickly as he could. After arriving back at Rorke's Drift, Chard immediately goes to see Major Spalding, Lieutenant Brumhead right on his tail. Chard reports what he has seen to Spalding, and that a likely Zulu attack is to commence somewhere around Isandlwana. Having observed the Zulus, Chard mentions that the enemy could be moving to attack the bridges, cutting off their main column from escape. Even more importantly, how could he defend the bridges with only 7 men? That's all he had stationed there. Reinforcements were supposed to have arrived already at Rorke's Drift from Captain Rainforth's company, yet they were nowhere to be seen. Why? This question intrigued Major Spalding. A low rumble can now be heard in the distance, everyone stopping what they are doing and now looking out over the Buffalo River. There's no mistaking it. That low rumble was cannon fire. Specifically, they are the low rumbles of the 2 7-pounder field batteries stationed at Isandlwana. Thinking for a moment, Major Spalding asks,
Which one of you is senior? You
he points to Chard.
or Bromhead?
Chard doesn't have the foggiest idea, neither does Brumhead, so Spalding leaves the 2 lieutenants alone and gets his army list. After a while, Spalding returns. I see you are the senior, he says to Chard.
So you will be in charge, although of course nothing will happen, and I shall be back again this evening.
Major Spalding decides to leave in search of the whereabouts of Captain Rainforth's reinforcements. So he places Chard in temporary command of Rorke's Drift as he rides off to find more information. Little did they know at the time, but Spalding putting Chard in overall command of Rorke's Drift may have been the greatest decision made for this battle. Chard is one of those rare cases where he is the wrong man at the right time. After all, he was an engineer. He didn't think so much like a tactician, but as a builder. In reality, Brumhead seemed more inclined to be the proper officer in charge. After all, he was a decent soldier raised in a notable British family. Chard was a nobody, just a man sent to Africa to build a bridge. After Spalding leaves, Chard leaves Rorke's Drift to return to his camp by the Buffalo River. If he's nervous, he's not showing it. But something has changed within the last hour or so. Specifically, the sounds from earlier. They had changed. Many had noticed this change because the cannon fire from Isandlwana had begun to stop. The British must have beaten the Zulus off, or perhaps this was just another small skirmish that happened to have artillery involved in it. Regardless, Chard sits down and eats his lunch, when off in the distance, riding like a bat out of hell, come a few disheveled men, covered in dust and grime, their horses soaked in sweat. He can barely hear what they're shouting.
The camp's been overtaken by the Zulus!
The camp's been overtaken by the Zulus!
Chard runs to meet them as they cross the river, and he's met by Lieutenant Gert Ardendorf, a Boer of Natal Native Contingent.
Are you the officer?
Ardendorf asks. Chard answers that he's temporarily in command, but Ardendorf quickly dismounts his horse and takes him aside. There he explains that the guns falling silent did not mean victory, but catastrophe. At Isandlwana, where Chard had been just a few hours earlier, the Zulus attacked in force. 1,300 British, colonial, and native troops were attacked, overrun, and slaughtered by over 20,000 Zulu Impi, where they quickly and efficiently used their horns of the buffalo to devastating effect. Chard cannot believe his ears. After all, here's Ardendorf, excited, panting, full of emotion. Surely he was exaggerating. But Ardendorf's companion, a carbineer, confirms the story. Chard swings into action, grabbing his horse, when suddenly a message from Lieutenant Bromhead arrives asking him to return to the camp immediately. Chard orders the breakdown of the camp and to put the supplies into the wagons as quickly as possible, because reality sinks in. If the Zulus had overrun Isandlwana, they could be heading directly for Rorke's Drift. Nothing would stop them. Chard also has 6 men posted on the opposite side of the Buffalo River on the hills to act as lookouts, as a warning if the Zulus arrived. Arriving back at Rorke's Drift, Chard calls a meeting with Bromhead and Commissionary Officer James Langley Dalton to help reach a consensus. Do they gather their sick and wounded and retreat to help Natal, where there would be reinforcements, or do they stay put and make a defensive strategy? It is Dalton who suggests that they stay and fight. But this isn't a decision made out of honor or bravery, but out of sheer desperation. If the British gathered their sick and wounded and marched off to help Natal, they are perfect targets. They would be slow-moving, mostly encumbered soldiers, which the Zulus would want. If they construct barricades, which Bromhead was already in the process of doing, they would at least have a fighting chance. This is where having Chard in command seemed to pay off the most. Together with Bromhead and Dalton, they deduced that Rorke's Drift actually makes a surprisingly good defensive position. The two houses are not overly far apart from each other, and there are stone walls already connecting them. If they flip the transport wagons, those can fill the gaps between the walls and the corral. If they stack melee bags on top of the stone wall, they can make a good defensive position to repulse oncoming Zulu assaults. The problem is there's little time to do this, and a lot of work that needed to be doing. But the stone walls also benefited from being built on a small 4-foot rocky ledge, which put the defenders at about 7 feet above where the Zulus would be attacking, making Rorke's Drift a small makeshift fortress. The store and the missionary, converted by now into a hospital, was also being loopholed. This way soldiers can stick their guns out and fight. This hospital had about 11 rooms. 5 of them had no internal door, which means they needed to use the external door to get in and out of the building. There is also a shortage of windows, which would prove to be beneficial during the battle. It will be hard for the Zulus to actually get into the hospital for this reason, but the lack of doors would prove to be an issue. Nevertheless, if the Zulus came, there'd be no possible way for escape. Their only hope for salvation would be for British reinforcements to arrive and relieve them. Private Alfred Henry Hook, someone who will become important later, said of the situation, "We were trapped like rats in a barrel." There is no denying the desperate situation befalling the British here. Interestingly, Lieutenant Ardendorf decides to stay and help with the defenses, while the others who escaped Isandlwana passed by, exclaiming the hopelessness of their situation. This made Chard somewhat irritable, as it caused great moral problems for the soldiers, but they nevertheless continued to work diligently, as if their lives depended on it, because it did. At around 4:20 p.m., gunfire came from over the hills, making the nervousness already running through Rorke's Drift even worse. But the worst was yet to come. After a brief scrapple, around 100 Natal native horse soldiers galloped down from the hills. These were survivors of Isandlwana, who had just fought a battle and had ridden hard throughout the afternoon. They gallop up to Rorke's Drift, where an officer professed to Chard that the Zulus were indeed coming, and their situation was hopeless. To save themselves, they were now riding to help Mekere. Though Chard and others pleaded for them to remain, they rode off, leaving the British to their own devices. Seeing this, those 300 men of the Natal Native Contingent, whose numbers had dwindled since the invasion of Zululand started, they began to desert. They completely ran from their posts and made a break for it. This dwindled the numbers of Rorkes Drift from around 340 men to just 140. This also includes the 30 men who are sick and wounded in the hospital. Many troops were furious at the native contingent when they noticed their officer, a corporal named Anderson, running with them. Several soldiers, including Private Frederick Hitch, opened fire on him, killing Anderson. Most escaped unharmed. Anderson would be the first casualty of the upcoming battle. But Color Sergeant Bourne looked at their desertion, these natives' desertion, as a good thing.
Feeling the native contingent,
They were untrustworthy, and in battle, they needed men they could trust. So while now they had less men, they were all people they could rely on. Chard reassesses the situation briefly as the men continued to work. He shows his engineering skills here, and deduces that they are now too thinly spread out. Springing into action, he plans what is called a redoubt. This would be a wall of biscuit boxes and melee bags, made with the sole purpose of a fallback point if the outer walls are breached in any way. The time is now 4:30 p.m. The walls are still in construction when from one of the rooftops, Private Hitch cries out,
Zulus! To the south! They're on the other side of the rise and extending for an attack! How many?
asked Brumhead. Hitch replies, 4,000 to 6,000 of them. The men in the hospital had not had time to make holes in the walls between the rooms. Everything happened so quickly. This will make communications inside the hospital extremely difficult. Each room now needs to act as its own independent body, instead of one solid unit. But Private Hitch had spotted around 500 to 600 Zulu warriors who had snuck their way around the southern flank. The Zulus had arrived. At around 4:30 p.m., the Zulus appeared on the southern flank of Rorkes Drift. The British had yet to complete their fortifications, and already the Zulu Impi were upon them. These Zulus had not fought at the Battle of Isandlwana. They were the loins, the reserved forces often called the Undi Corps. They are ordered to swing west and south to sever the line of retreat and communications for the British Army. The command of this Undi Corps, marching on Rorkes Drift, fell to King Cetshwayo's half-brother, Prince Dabulamanze Kampande. Unlike at Isandlwana, the prince acted in direct violation of Cetshwayo's orders. He crossed out of Zululand and into Natal Africa, British territory. These warriors were older, and they wanted the right to marry, as described earlier. They wanted glory, as they saw it robbed from them at Isandlwana. They wanted to carry the honor and prestige of having the Zulu white shields. Altogether, the prince has around 3,000 to 4,000 Zulus under his direct command, and they were now marching upon Rorkes Drift, and they wanted blood. Having just run miles upon miles upon miles, these men were tired, but no less determined to make a name for themselves. These Zulu warriors beat their shields, chanted their cries of death and intimidation, were fed their narcotics, and were blessed by their witch doctors for total victory over the British. And now they charged straight for the southern walls of Rorkes Drift, and the battle had begun. Private Hitch yells to Brumhead,
They'll be all around us soon!
Brumhead snaps into action.
To your posts, men!
He shouts, the British grabbing their Martini Henry rifles and pith helmets as they clamor for the walls. Hitch suddenly hears a gunshot and ducks, the bullet way off. He can see a Zulu upon the hills in front of him, the musket smoke thick. He fires back, but misses, continues to scan the area. He then notices a Zulu moving into the caves on the hill, a lone warrior appearing, the Zulu waving his arm back and forth.
this Zulu was likely Prince Kampande.
At around 500 yards, Brumhead gave the order to fire. At first, the British Martini Henrys did little, but as the Zulus grew closer and closer, the true extent of their firepower became more evident. One after the other, the Zulus dropped, most of them wounded with gaping holes made by the powerful Martini Henry round. Entire limbs would be blown off, blood flying in every direction, coating their fellow warriors around them. But they were Zulu! Zulus don't run that easily. Despite their losses mounting, the British fire non-stop, their chants, "Usu! Usu!" The chant of their king, "Kill! Kill! Kill! Death! Death! Death!" echoed loudly in the surrounding hills, encouraging others to keep going, keep fighting, keep running. Chard recalls seeing the oncoming Zulus and thinking that nothing could stop them. No amount of volley fire halted the oncoming advance. Private Hook can see the Zulus coming within 50 yards. They became stuck in a deadly crossfire, one from the hospital, the other from the storehouse. But soon, everyone can see that the Zulus had begun using the cookhouse and stoves left in the camp as cover. Zulus with muskets were brought forward from these positions, and they began to fire upon the British with little accuracy. The Zulus used anthills, brush, empty boxes left by the British, fallen comrades, anything that could help shield them during their advance on Rorke's Drift. Eventually, even the Zulus could see they needed to regroup and pull back after suffering horrific losses, most of them wounded. The British had held the first wave, the Zulus not making much of a dent once they reached the walls. Chard, Brumhead, and Dalton's plan appeared to be working. They had taken few casualties and sustained a heavy attack. But their relief would be diminished as a regiment of older Zulus charged and wrapped around the smaller fortifications to the west side of Rorke's Drift. The Zulus continued to move until curving around and attacking the north wall. Now they had an attack from the south and the north at once, stretching the British dangerously thin as Chard had feared. But what kept the Zulus at bay was a constant stream of fire, thanks to the chaplain, who organized wounded soldiers to help disperse rounds and cartridges to soldiers fighting at the wall. It was not uncommon to see wounded soldiers crawling on the dusty ground, empty shells all around them, handing bullets and planting cartridges at the feet of the main defenders. The next Zulu wave began, this time with a new strategy. Using the brush as cover, they crawled their way until getting relatively close to the British walls. Then they sprang up, starting a protracted assault along the northwest ramparts. The hospital was now under assault. Dalton inside, trying his best to ascertain the situation. He can see the desperation of the defenders holding back at bayonet point the oncoming Zulu attackers. He notices a corporal in trouble, a Zulu standing over him, ready to stab the boy with his assegai. But Dalton grabs the nearest rifle, prayed it was loaded, and fired, killing the Zulu. By now, the Zulus had ascertained that the British walls were just too high to cross. Many hid below them as the British fired overhead, surrounded by their screaming and wounded. But in the nearby hills, the Zulus began raining down fire of their own. Using their outdated muskets, they aimed at the defenders below as best as they could, most of the shots missing, but nevertheless causing a great annoyance for the British. Meanwhile, another wave of Zulus crashed against the hospital and northwestern walls like a tsunami crashing against the shoreline. Here, in their desperation, the Zulus managed to climb over the wall by using the bodies of their fallen warriors, most of which were still alive. Using the bodies as stepping stools, they scaled the wall, and a fierce melee ensued with Brumhead in the thick of it. Using his revolver, Brumhead stood firm with his soldiers fighting the Zulus off, sometimes 2 to 3 men at a time. A cadence began to shape. The British soldiers forming small groups of 2s and 3s, while one man reloads, another man fires and covers him with his bayonet. When the other man is reloaded, he fires and covers his comrade with his own bayonet. It became a dance of life and death, the Zulus showing no signs of stopping. Eventually, the melee proved to be too strong for the British, and an order was given to regroup and pull back. The British do so, gathering in ranks and giving massive blasts of controlled volley fire into the oncoming Zulu ranks. This proved too much for the already weakened Zulus, and at the point of bayonet, Brumhead led in advance and retook this portion of the wall. Color Sergeant Frank Bourne could see the Zulus leaping over their parapets, many grabbing hold of British bayonets only to be blasted by a Martini Henry. The carnage was immeasurable, their entire chunks of flesh, muscle, and bone exposed from these wounds. Yet Bourne could not help but admire the bravery of these Zulus, finding respect for them, a respect he never had before. Having watched every movement made by the British from on top of a nearby hill, Prince Campande deduced that the weak point of Rorke's drift was the front of the hospital. Now, despite the heavy losses, the prince could enact his coup de grace. He could advance the head of his buffalo, his horns revealing the enemy's weakness. A new assault began, this time the Zulus concentrating all of their power on the front of the hospital. Yet here exposed the fatal flaw of Zulu tactics. Ntshingwayo gave no tactical device other than this single point. The Zulus were not to attack defensive positions. For their warriors to succeed, the enemy needed to be in the open and exposed as they were at Isandlwana. The prince failed to heed this order, or better yet, he failed to adapt his strategy. Chard witnesses wave after wave after wave of Zulu attacks against the hospital, only for each to be repulsed, the Zulu survivors crouching down and disappearing into the thick brushes. From inside the hospital, Private Hook defends one of these rooms. Aiming through his loophole, he fires shot after shot from his rifle. He remains to be the only defender in this room, a sick man beside him and a man with a broken leg on the other side. He refers to the sick man as Old King Cole. King Cole kept up with Hook for some time, but he got scared during the fight. He cries out that he isn't going to stay in this hospital anymore, but Hook knows better. These walls were safer than being out in the open with hundreds of Zulus coming at once. He pleads with King Cole to stay, but the man has made up his mind. Hook is powerless to do anything, fires a few more rounds, and watches King Cole be killed. The sight frightens the man with the broken leg. He begins to scream,
"Untie my leg! I need to get out! I need to get out!"
but Hook can't do anything. He sees the Zulus, aims his Martini Henry, fires again, the smoke filling the room. By now the smoke was so thick he can barely see 2 feet in front of him. Gunshots echoing all around him, the Zulus chanting on the other side of the wall, little light coming in from outside, a man with a broken leg beside him wailing away, the Zulu musket fire whistling through the room. It was chaos. And meanwhile, Dalton was on the outside, encouraging his men to stand fast, rifle in hand. He moves back and forth, hands cartridges to soldiers, then takes a few shots himself. "Keep steady," he shouts. "Keep steady." He sees a Zulu moving up onto the barricades. "Pop that fellow," he barks as he aims his rifle. Suddenly, he feels a sharp pain, and he realizes he's not been stabbed, but shot, a Zulu marksman finding his target. A doctor runs up to his aid, rips a hole in his shirt, and discovers that a bullet had gone straight through his shoulder. But that wasn't going to stop Dalton. Dalton gets back up and continues to fight with the others. By 6 o'clock p.m., the Zulus began another attack, this time extending further to the exposed left. Chard watches intently and begins to fear that the Zulus could make it over the wall and use their biscuit boxes for cover inside their fortifications. He looks around, sees 3 or 4 men nearby, grabs them, and pushes towards the wall section. Brumhead is nearby, bringing 2 and 3 more with him. Together, they help hold off this attack, but Chard couldn't see the writing on the wall. The Zulu sharpshooters were getting more and more accurate. He orders his soldiers to retreat to the second line of fortifications, since it's shielded from the Zulu sharpshooters. Only just giving the order, he watches a commissary officer giving water to a wounded soldier. He sees that commissary officer being shot in the head by a Zulu on top of the hill. By ordering a withdrawal to the inner entrenchments, Chard has achieved 2 things. First, he can now use the redoubt as cover from Zulu marksmen, and second, his troops will now be in a smaller, more localized area, meaning heavier and more devastating firepower. However, Chard has inadvertently isolated the men in the hospital in doing so. The main British body withdrawing, those left inside the hospital were now isolated as another Zulu attack commenced. This time, the Zulus focused their energy on the hospital's west side. Inside was a scene of utter desperation. These rooms were dark. They had no windows. But as mentioned earlier, many didn't have doors leading from one room to the next. This would prove challenging for the defenders. Private John and Joseph Williams' room became the primary target of the Zulus. A few others were in the room with them, all aiming through loopholes and firing every bullet they had. Yet the Zulus kept coming. Realizing their desperate situation, John Williams, seeing no alternative, used his bayonet to slice a hole into the wall leading into the next room, also being defended by a couple of British soldiers. Joseph Williams and another soldier kept up their fire, holding back the Zulus as long as they could until both men ran out of ammunition. Their bayonets became their only defense. Zulus now bursting into the hospital, desperately trying to break into the individual rooms. John Williams turns, the hole in the wall now complete, yells for the others to get through, but the Zulus are charging inside. Joseph Williams uses his bayonet and beats several away, but he's ripped from the room and given to the mercy of the Zulus. In their bloodlust, the Zulus grabbed his arms and legs and stretched them outward, and with their spears disemboweled Private Joseph Williams until his body was almost non-recognizable. John Williams was not the only one with this idea of cutting a hole through the walls to escape. 2 rooms down, where John Williams had headed, 9 defenders barely held their own. One of them was Private Hook. The moment Williams made his way into their room, the next hole was almost completed. Then they moved into the next one, and the next one, more Zulus coming in from all sides. Some had even started coming down from above, the Zulus using their spears to cut holes through the straw roof. Hook has just shot another Zulu, reloaded his rifle, felt his helmet yank to one side, knocking him backwards. He looks to one side, notices a Zulu assegai had been thrown at him, his helmet saving his life. But Hook has little time to revel. As his fellow soldiers moved into the next room, one at a time, a Zulu bolted towards him and grabbed his rifle. Thinking fast, Hook regained control over his gun and blasted the attacker at point-blank range. About to head through the wall, Hook happens to see someone left behind, a man nearby named Conley, who could not walk because of a broken leg. Before the Zulus could get to Conley, Hook made a mad dash for him, the wounded man in one arm, his rifle in the other. He pulls Conley through the small hole into the next room, accidentally breaking Conley's leg again, but saving the man's life. Less than a second later, Zulus poured into their old room. Many seeing the holes in the walls and trying to crawl through it, they were greeted by gunfire and bayonets. Remember, there were little for windows in this building. The only light that was coming in was from the loopholes used for their Martini Henrys. Smoke from gunfire filled each room, blinding anyone who entered. Little ventilation making it hard for anyone to even breathe. And the sound. The small rooms creating a perfect chamber to amplify the already ear-piercingly loud rifles. Then came the groaning of the wounded Zulus and British, the sounds of people punching holes through the walls, the Zulus themselves chanting and screaming, the British trying to hear one another through the chaos. Insanity is a good word to describe it. All the while, sometime during the desperate fighting, the hospital roof had caught fire. Smoke began billowing down the hallways and into the rooms, Zulus everywhere as well. Many British hunkered down in the hopes that they would wait until nightfall. A few dashed for the new British lines, only to be stabbed to death. However, after crawling through loophole after loophole, many of the survivors made it to the room lining the inside of the new British inner defenses. The wounded were the first to be taken out of the windows. Most were carried to the rear. And better yet, most of the defenders of the hospital made it out against all odds. And while the Zulus tried to capitalize on their capturing of this hospital, it proved unattainable as the building burned around them. In the distance, Major Spalding was returning with 2 companies of the promised reinforcements from earlier. Here, Spalding had hopes of relieving the garrison at Rorke's Drift. A few of the men inside Rorke's Drift could barely make out their red coats, and many cheered. Relief was here, they were saved. But instead of attacking the Zulus as Chard hoped, Spalding remained still. Spalding surveyed the area as night rapidly approached. He could see the hospital burning and hear the chants of the Zulus. Instead of riding to relieve those at Rorke's Drift, he turns around. To Spalding, the number of Zulus was too great, and that the garrison at Rorke's Drift had all been killed. This would be the second time that day that Spalding would prove to be woefully incorrect. By now, night had begun to fall. Yet even after hours of constant fighting, the Zulus, with their usual tenacity, showed no signs of stopping. After hours of continuous fighting, the Battle of Rorke's Drift continued throughout the night. By nightfall, the flames of the burning hospital illuminated the oncoming Zulus, giving the exhausted British soldiers a good look at their enemy. Despite successfully holding off wave after wave of Zulu attacks, the British now found themselves in a desperate and precarious situation. Having fired almost non-stop, many soldiers found their Martini Henrys jamming from wear, or their barrels just too hot to handle. And to add to it all, they were now surrounded. Many soldiers saw the hospital burning as a blessing in disguise. It gave them light, a way to see the Zulus as night went on. Private Hook remained at his post, guarding an exposed corner of their defenses. Brumhead stood beside him, the others dead. On more than one occasion, the Zulus managed to penetrate this one point, only for Brumhead, Hitch, and Hook to beat them back, guns red hot, bayonets covered in blood and guts. Eventually, one Zulu slipped past them. Hitch saw him and called out for Brumhead. But before he could shoot the Zulu, a musket fired, hitting Hitch through the shoulder, taking a chunk out of his scapula. He crumpled over in pain, sure that this was the end, but Brumhead was there. Revolver crackling off, both Zulus falling to the ground in a heap. He then attended to Hitch. Seeing as his shoulder was all but gone, Brumhead reloaded his pistol and handed it to Hitch. With this new weapon in hand, Hitch continued to defend this side of the fortress throughout the night. Meanwhile, Chard was keeping busy. From inside their smaller entrenchments, he ordered the construction of a new redoubt, a smaller inner circle with stepping stools made of biscuit boxes. If they had to pull back again, they could concentrate in this redoubt, stand upon the biscuit boxes, and shoot down at the Zulus, giving them a better vantage point. But while this was happening, the Zulus had adjusted their plan yet again. Seeing the fires were exposing their attacks, they shifted to the northern walls, where the burning hospital casted a massive shadow. What had been an accidental savior for the British those first few hours into the night had just become their curse. The Zulus crawled on the darkened ground, often over the bodies of their fallen comrades, then would spring up at the last second, often just a few feet in front of the British. But as the night wore on and the British became thirstier and thirstier, their water now gone, so did the ferocity of the Zulu attacks. Every time the British would try to leave their new entrenchments to get water, the Zulus would be there to greet them. This dance back and forth continued for hours. Chard continues to pace back and forth behind the walls. He can hear Zulu shouting "Uzuzu" to his left, and then suddenly an attack would come from his right. The Zulus had gone back to playing their mind games, which they did so well, especially in the realm of intimidation. But sometime after 10 p.m., Prince Kampunde must have realized his chance of glory had gone. The time had passed. Because Chard notices that after this time, the attacks began to waver, but never stopping full sail. These faint attacks would never stop, however. The Zulus would appear, then disappear just as quickly, keeping the British on edge the entire night, the Zulus playing mind games. But as the hospital fire slowly dimmed and January 23rd began, the fighting all but stopped. Rorke's Drift had become a bloodbath for the Zulus. In every direction, their dead and wounded littered the grounds, both inside and outside of the compound. Chard listened to their moans of agony, his men still at the ready to receive another attack at any moment. Chard and Brumhead feared a renewed attack by the Zulus as the sun crested the skies, and they knew deep down that they simply could not hold like they did the day before. If the Zulus came back, the defenders of Rorke's Drift were done for. But Chard can hardly believe his eyes. As the sun grew higher and higher into the South African skies, the Zulus were gone. They had moved past the southwest hills, out of sight, but certainly not out of mind. Having run 20 miles the day before, the Zulus then fought non-stop for hours on end. They were finally too exhausted to continue. They had not achieved the glory they so desperately wanted to. In fact, the entire campaign into Natal proved to be a disaster, just as King Ntshingwayo predicted. But panic momentarily struck the British as they looked onto the hills overlooking Rorke's Drift. A large detachment of Zulus stood above the crest, peering down at them with watchful eyes. But soon they too left with the other Zulus, having spotted a British cavalry column off in the distance. Relief for those in Rorke's Drift was finally underway, and many of these exhausted men found the energy to rise up and cheer the relief columns arriving in force. Some cried, some prayed, and thanked God. Most were just thankful to be alive. They had survived an overwhelming enemy against all odds and lived. 4,000 Zulus, the greatest warriors in all of Africa, versus 180 soldiers of mostly B Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot. And now, after all this fighting and death and carnage, came the aftermath. Chard counts 351 dead Zulus as the day wears on, most of the men now burying the bodies and collecting the Zulu shields and spears. The British had also done some counting of their own, and despite their horrific circumstances, the British lost 17 killed and 15 wounded. They soon discovered that the vast majority of the fallen Zulus were not dead at all. Most of the Zulus still on the ground were alive, buried under comrades who had crossed over them in the height of the battle. Some had tried to escape, but a round from a Martini Henry devastates the human body. In a bit of fury, the British defenders, unable to control their rage at seeing their own dead comrades eviscerated by the Zulus, moved about the wounded and stabbed them with their bayonets to finish the job. Most of the wounded Zulus were bayoneted in the head, silencing them once and for all. Today, this would be considered a war crime, but in the height of the Victorian era, this was just a common act of war. Terrible, but true. It cannot be understated, the bravery of the British defenders at Rorke's Drift. As mentioned earlier, they had survived against odds of almost unmeasurable amounts. 11 of these men were awarded the Victoria Cross for their bravery. And while the British bravery is in full display, one cannot deny the Zulu warriors' utter tenacity and determination, strength, and bravery. No matter how many of their comrades were shot down beside them or in front or behind, they nevertheless continued to attack. And ultimately, they paid an exorbitant heavy price. King Ntshingwayo reportedly said, "An assegai has been thrust into the belly of the nation." They had lost brave, experienced warriors that they will undoubtedly have difficulty replacing. And that concludes the Battle of Rorke's Drift. I end this video with a familiar tune because, well, how can I not? This is Adam Noyce. Thank you for watching.